What if the greatest threat to war wasn't a weapon, but a kiss? What if love between species never meant to meet could dismantle entire systems? In this hauntingly beautiful tale, a human combat medic breaks every rule to save a dying alien warrior. What begins as an act of mercy becomes a journey of defiance, identity, and transformation. Together, they discover something their governments fear more than rebellion: compassion without permission. As their story spreads across the galaxy, it fractures propaganda, reshapes memory, and leads to the birth of a child with no flag, but infinite future. Stay with us as we unravel the most forbidden union the stars have ever witnessed. Would you choose connection, if it meant betraying everything you were built to believe? She was no longer a soldier. She was a discarded mechanism in a failed war engine, left to bleed among the crushed rocks of a moon soaked in the memory of molten fire. The assault had failed. Proxima B9, the mineral-rich satellite, had resisted the invasion like a living thing spitting out a foreign body. And so did her kind spit her out, deeming her useless, obsolete, infected by weakness. The sky above shimmered like cracked glass. The auroras here weren't natural, they were born from decaying orbitals and shattered atmospheric shields, creating a haunted dome of lights that flickered like dying memories. Beneath that fractured canopy, Commander Seraxa crawled, dragging what was left of her crystalline body through fields of carbonized bones and shattered battle plates. Her right leg, once a precision-crafted limb of semi-living alloy, was now a scorched stump, crudely sealed with plasma from her own pistol, an act of both survival and silent rebellion. Ryan doctrine forbade such desperation. A wounded warrior was to self-terminate, not struggle like vermin beneath the judgment of the stars. Her breath came in whistling rasp chords, vibrating across the translucent cavities of her collapsed chest. The smell of ionized blood and pulverized stone filled her sensory flutes, every intake of breath burning like acid. Her kind, the Ryans, were taught that pain was a shadow to be denied, not a message to be heard. But in this moment, crawling across the silent graveyard of her own battalion, Seraxa heard it all. And it screamed one thing: you are alone. The stars watched, indifferent. And then, a footstep. Singular. Soft. Impossible. She froze. Her first instinct was defense. Her hand twitched toward the side where her weapon holster used to be, gone, melded, forgotten in the chaos. Her second instinct was surrender, to end it all before she could be dissected, defiled, or displayed. The propaganda of her people had painted humans as sadistic, unpredictable, born of chaos and emotional rot. They did not follow logic. They did not honor surrender. They felt, and that made them monsters. "Don't move," said a voice not in Ryan fractal code, but in the sector's common tongue. Gentle. Steady. Human. The figure stepped forward, and Seraxa's fractured vision pieced together a silhouette beneath the stormlight. It wore dust-covered armor with red and white stripes across the arm, a medic's designation. His hands were raised, one clutching a field kit, the other extended slightly, not threatening, not commanding. It was offering. He knelt beside her, his movements fluid but cautious. Close now. She could see the grime across his helmet visor, the subtle trembling of fingers worn thin from triage and trauma. She expected him to speak again, to curse her, accuse her, dissect her with words. Instead, he reached down and gently peeled away the saturated dressing wrapped around what remained of her leg. "It's cauterized, but barely holding," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Seraxa found her voice, or the ghost of it. "I am the enemy," she said. Her vocalizer glitched, clicking against the translation implant's imperfect conversion of her crystalline speech. "No. You're just someone who's dying," the medic said, already pulling a syringe from his pack. "And I didn't become a medic to let people die when I can help them." The syringe entered her shoulder before she could protest. Pain dulled instantly. The shaking ceased. Her vision stabilized. But confusion amplified. This creature should have let her rot. That was protocol. That was survival. This was something else. As he examined her wound, his gloved hands hovered like priests over sacred scripture. She noticed that he avoided eye contact, not out of disgust, but out of respect. He was tending to her not like an animal, not like an enemy, but like an equal. "Why?" she asked again, voice heavier, slower. "Why help me?" He hesitated. "Because if I don't, what's the point of all this?" And in that moment, something cracked, not just the bone beneath her skin, but the doctrine etched into her soul. The certainty of what made someone an enemy, or a threat, or disposable, was dissolving. She watched this human work not because he had to, not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to. That choice echoed louder than any command. But that was not the end of the moment, it was only its threshold. Because then, he did the unthinkable, he picked her up. Lifted her broken, still bleeding body and cradled it against his armored chest. Her kind would have called it defilement. But in that heat, in that strange rhythm of his twin heartbeats thudding near her auditory fronds, Seraxa felt something ancient and terrifying awaken. Not weakness. Not pity. Hope. And beneath the ash-blown sky, through the mine-ridden valley of twisted wreckage and the howling wind that carried the names of the dead, the last surviving Ryan commander deemed obsolete was carried in the arms of a human medic who no longer cared which banner she fought for. His breath was labored. Her body was limp. And between them stretched a silence that no war had ever dared to allow. What if we were wrong about each other? The cave swallowed sound. It was not a place of refuge, but of waiting for the pain to return, waiting for death to reclaim what the battlefield had already half devoured. She sat propped against the cool stone wall, her translucent skin dimming under the pulsating biolight now fading from within. Her people's war doctrine had no room for half-deaths. There was only full function or ceremonial termination. And yet she was here. Still breathing. Still broken. The human had set up a crude shelter inside the remnants of what seemed to be a collapsed transport vessel. Makeshift walls of scorched alloy, rusted girders, and canvas sheets filtered in flickers of ruined sunlight. The air carried the copper scent of ionized blood, smoke, and rust. But it was strangely warm. Not from fire. Not from heaters. From intention. He moved like someone accustomed to exhaustion. Each step carried the hesitation of someone trained to help but punished for compassion. His armor was mismatched civilian gear patched with old military plating, a medic's insignia worn almost apologetically on his chest. He wasn't built for war. He was shaped by it. And he had spared her. Her kind did not spare. If a soldier fell, they were erased name, record, identity. Kindness was an inefficient redundancy. Yet here she was, lying under a thermal blanket stitched with human script, painkillers dulling the fire in her nerves, watching a human boil water in a dented pot. Like this was not a war, but a world where people survived together. She studied his face without speaking. The creases near his eyes suggested years, though his species aged chaotically. Dirt and ash clung to the lines of his jaw, but his movements remained careful, almost ceremonial, as he crushed tablets into a paste. His hands shook slightly, only when he thought she wasn't looking. He offered her a spoon. She hesitated. In Ryan culture, eating from another's hand was symbolic. It denoted bond, surrender, dependency. Her people reserved it for ritual adoption or lovers. To accept this nourishment now, in this form, from an enemy, it was more than sustenance. It was heresy. She took it. The taste was bitter, unfamiliar, chemical. But it burned warmth into her chest, spread out like a second heartbeat. For a moment, the cave flickered not with light, but memory. She saw, for the first time, her commanders standing in formation, sterile, perfect, distant. Not one of them would have done this. Not one of them had ever asked if she was afraid. Not one of them had ever said her name aloud without rank first. The human sat across from her now, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. She spoke. "You could have killed me." He didn't look up. "I still could." She blinked. "But you won't." "No," he said. "That's not why I came here." Silence returned, not awkward, but stretching. Between them lay an invisible landscape neither had maps for. He finally said, "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you." He glanced at her leg, the biosynth graft not yet complete, wrapped in silver gauze, still humming faintly. "You're fragile," he said, and then added, "but not weak." Her voice crackled. "To be fragile is to be weak in my culture." He shook his head. "Not in mine. Sometimes it's the fragile things that remind us we're alive." That confused her. In Ryan philosophy, life was motion, progress, obedience. No room for fragility. Yet here was a creature who had spent resources, time, and risk to keep her alive for no strategic gain. No extraction. No interrogation. Just care. "Why?" she asked again, as if her language could not carry the full weight of the question. He stared at her, and in his eyes she saw not a soldier but a man who had seen too much death to let one more happen senselessly. "Because once, someone spared me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo. Worn. Torn edges. A human family, smiling beside a lake. "They were the enemy, too," he said. "When I was shot down over Altus Prime, I crawled into a civilian home. I didn't even know the language. But an old woman kept me hidden for 2 weeks, fed me, cleaned my wounds. She should have turned me in. Instead, she gave me this photo when I left. Said, 'Even enemies have mothers.'" The words struck her deeper than any blade. Even enemies have mothers. She turned away, unable to process the paradox. Kindness was not supposed to make sense. It wasn't logical. It wasn't scalable. It was the kind of choice her culture had designed entire systems to eliminate. And yet, it had preserved her life. His voice softened. "I'm not asking you to understand. Just to survive." He stood, turning toward the medical terminal. But before he moved far, her voice tentative, fragile echoed softly, "My designation is Seraxa." He turned. Not in surprise, but with reverence. "I'm Elias," he replied. "Not Lieutenant. Just Elias." They stood there, two remnants of two shattered ideologies, their names echoing through the quiet like forgotten prayers. Names that would never be etched on monuments. But names that, for the first time, carried meaning beyond command or rank. And as she lay back against the stone, biolight softly flickering, Seraxa realized that the hand that should have killed her had instead taught her something her entire empire had failed to. Mercy is not weakness. It's rebellion. The humming of the biosynth unit was unlike any sound she had known. It wasn't mechanical. It breathed. A low, rhythmic vibration that echoed in the small, shadowed chamber, pulsing in sync with her fractured nervous system as if learning her song before it dared to rewrite her. Seraxa lay motionless, eyes reflecting dim lights from the ceiling, modulated blues and silver greens, soft as starlight on frozen glass. Her damaged form was suspended within the healing cradle, a cocoon of adaptive alloy and bioresponsive gel that shimmered like quicksilver against her pale skin. Tubes laced with nutrients, stimulants, and coded signals snaked into the graft point where a leg should have been, where his technology now whispered to her cells, grow, connect, remember what it was to move. Elias stood beside the console, his hands hovering, trembling not from exhaustion but from doubt. This device, experimental, unauthorized, was never meant for someone like her. It had been designed for decorated human generals, top-tier commandos. Not for enemies. Not for Ryans. And especially not for someone he was no longer sure he wanted to call an enemy. Her physiology fought the fusion at first. Her tissues pulsed with internal alarms, sending defense markers to attack the unfamiliar systems. But the biosynth responded not with invasion but with negotiation. It adapted, shifted shape, matched temperature, even adjusted its glow to mirror the faint bioluminescence of her remaining limbs. The graft began not as a conquest of flesh, but as a conversation. "Smart machine," she murmured on the second day, her voice filtered through pain. "It's not the machine," Elias replied quietly. "It's you. You're teaching it." She turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. "We were taught human tech was aggressive, rigid, always trying to overwrite. So were we," he said, almost to himself. "Taught that you were cold, calculating, incapable of adaptation." The silence stretched again, only this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was contemplative, almost sacred. Outside, storms raged across the horizon, ion blizzards that stripped sensors and buried war remnants beneath sand and static. But here, in this stolen sanctuary of rusted steel and forbidden care, a different kind of storm unfolded. Not one of violence, but of inner upheaval. By the third night, the limb began to move. First a twitch, then a pulse. By morning, it had synced with her neural pattern. She blinked at it in awe. Its surface was semi-transparent, revealing a mesh of photonic veins interlaced with bioluminescent threads, her threads. The artificial had become organic. The human-made had become hers. Elias didn't speak much that morning. He busied himself with other tasks, adjusting settings, sterilizing tools, documenting readings. But Seraxa could sense his mind elsewhere. His movements lacked rhythm. His focus was cracked. As if something inside him had broken loose during the healing process, not hers, but his. "Do you resent it?" she asked, surprising even herself with the directness. He looked up, caught off guard. "What?" "That your enemy now carries your species' technology, as part of her body." He stepped closer, eyes shadowed but honest. "No, I think I resent that it took this long for me to realize what that means." She said nothing. Let the silence draw him out. "I signed up thinking I'd heal our soldiers so they could fight better. Come home alive. Be heroes. But now, I'm watching something I helped build become part of someone I was told not to see as a person. And it works better than it ever did with humans. like it was meant for you all along. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, then muttered, maybe healing was never about sides. She studied him for a long time before replying. Ryans would call this weakness. Then your people have no idea what strength is. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Later that day, when the leg responded fluidly for the first time, flexed, bent, balanced, she asked if it could be removed. Not because she rejected it, but because she feared how much she had accepted it. She feared the identity shift buried inside the synthetic bone. The idea that part of her was no longer Ryan. No longer warborn. He didn't answer immediately. He took her vitals. Checked the graph points. Adjusted sensitivity. Then finally said, we can't cut off the past. We can only learn to walk with it. And then he told her something he had never spoken aloud, not to his command, not to his fellow medics, not even to himself. When my younger brother died, I signed up the next day. Thought healing others would stop me from breaking apart. Thought if I saved enough people, I wouldn't feel like it was my fault. She didn't interrupt. The biosynth hummed beneath them. But the more I saw, the more I realized I wasn't healing anyone. Just sending them back out to die cleaner. And then I found you. And you weren't supposed to survive. But you did. And now I'm not sure who I'm trying to save anymore. The confession hung between them, sharp and raw. And for the first time in her life, Seraxa reached for someone not in combat, not in duty, but in empathy. She placed her six-fingered hand gently over his. A gesture alien to him. A gesture forbidden to her. Her voice was a whisper. Perhaps we are both being remade. The cave had grown quieter, but not because the world outside had calmed. In fact, the storms had grown worse. Ion gales now swept across Proxima's surface, stripping rocks into glass, folding dust into pillars that pulsed like living monoliths. But within the hollowed chamber of scavenged metal and living circuits, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something else. Understanding. She no longer flinched when he approached. He no longer hesitated to touch her synthetic leg, adjusting its calibration without asking. At first, every contact had been clinical, cautious. Now, it was ritual. A language made of gestures, pressures, glances, moments held one breath longer than necessary. And when the words failed, they relied on the machine. The biosynth leg had evolved. Its feedback loop wasn't just mechanical, it was emotive. It pulsed in response to her mood, shimmering in bioluminescent patterns that Elias began to read intuitively. Joy rippled in fractal blue. Frustration echoed in orange spikes. Fatigue was dull silver. She hadn't meant to show him these colors. They were involuntary, a trait of her species rarely seen outside sacred rites. But he learned them anyway. He never asked their names. Never forced her to explain. Instead, he mirrored them, blinking lights on his console in matching hues. At first, she thought it was a joke. Then a coincidence. But by the third day, when she showed fear and he answered with violet light and lowered his gaze in synchronized stillness, she knew. He was speaking her without sound. On the fourth night, during a power flux that caused their auxiliary lights to flicker out, she lit the cave with her own body. Soft patterns rippled across her skin, illuminating the metal walls in slow waves. Elias sat across from her, holding a circuit board he wasn't fixing, just watching. And then, gently, he traced a shape on the floor with his finger, a spiral. Ryan, for listen. She responded with her palm, tracing a counter spiral over his. Human for yes. And something clicked between them. Not the clicking of machines, not language in the spoken sense, but a resonance. A field of meaning that hovered in the air like static before a storm. Later, when she leaned close to inspect a microfracture on the new limb, her breath brushed his shoulder and the lights on the biosynth surged into a burst of gold. She did not apologize. He did not question. The silence said everything. They began testing the limits. Could she feel what he thought before he spoke? Could he guess her needs before she moved? Sometimes, she'd reach for a tool and find it already in his hand. Sometimes, he'd pause mid-sentence, realizing she'd already answered with a change in her glow. She began to hum softly in Ryan tonal resonance frequencies meant to convey meaning through vibration, and discovered that his biosynth earpiece translated none of it, yet he felt all of it. It was not telepathy. Not exactly. Not like the kind described in hushed UFO encounters where abductees claimed aliens spoke without speaking. But it was parallel. It was proximity reshaping cognition. She thought of those stories once, recounted in data logs from the outer stations. Humans taken aboard ships, described beings who never opened their mouths yet poured entire lifetimes into a single glance. Seraxa had dismissed those tales as myth. But now, with Elias adjusting her biosynth sensor and murmuring "I know" before she even asked, she wondered. What if communication isn't about sound? What if it's about willingness? The more she let herself be known, the less she needed to explain. And the more he watched her, the more he stopped looking at her and began looking with her. Through her eyes, her instincts, her silences. One afternoon, during a diagnostic session, she let the limb fall limp just to see how he'd react. He froze, looked at her, and simply whispered, "You're not broken. Just tired." She hadn't said a word. And that's when she realized what terrified her most. This man, this strange, illogical creature of emotion and softness, had crossed some invisible threshold. He no longer needed to speak to reach her. And that made him more dangerous than any weapon her kind had ever deployed. Because he wasn't trying to dominate her. He was trying to understand her. That night, while staring into the phosphorescent ceiling of the cave, she finally asked, "Do you think the war began because we never listened?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, "No, I think it began because we never wanted to." And her biosynth flared green, not sadness. Not agreement. Regret. They lay there, separated by species, culture, history, but joined now by a shared language no one else had taught them. One born of proximity, of mutual injury, and something far more alien than their DNA, trust. And when the silence spoke again, neither interrupted. They just listened. The wind outside no longer sounded like weather. It screamed. It howled through metal bones buried in the rock, shrieking like ghosts clawing at the skin of the moon. And still, the two fugitives moved, deeper into the planet's underlayers, each step a betrayal of every loyalty they'd once sworn. Elias moved first, slow, silent, his pulse pounding beneath a throat full of guilt. Seraxa followed, one hand pressed against the tunnel walls for balance, her new leg glowing faintly, the biolight rippling in reaction to the magnetic strata beneath. The ground hummed with a strange pulse, not natural, not random. As if the very rock remembered something. The cave was not a cave. It breathed. The air was warm but not from geothermal vents. It held static. Intention. As they descended, walls widened and began to take shape, not the ragged disorder of collapsed stone, but patterns. Structures. Geometry impossible in nature, symmetrical curves flowing into octagonal chambers lit by embedded crystals that glowed not from electricity but memory. Seraxa stopped. Touched a wall. The stone responded. A ripple of light arced outward from her palm, like veins awakening beneath the skin of a forgotten god. Glyphs emerged, unreadable but familiar, triggering something dormant in her ancestral instinct or perhaps just awe. Elias stepped beside her and whispered, "This wasn't built by your kind, was it?" She shook her head. "Nor yours." They moved carefully now, not as fugitives but pilgrims. This place demanded reverence. The next chamber widened into a dome, and there suspended at its apex was a fissure in the ceiling. Through it shone the twin suns of Proxima B9, aligned perfectly, casting light that twisted midair into refracted spirals. The beams bent around each other like dancers, painting the space in braided radiance. It wasn't just beautiful. It was deliberate. This sanctuary had been built to witness convergence of suns, of paths, of species. They didn't speak for hours. Just wandered. Observed. Seraxa traced murals carved into the stone, depicting bipedal beings with elongated skulls standing hand in hand not as soldiers, but as something else entirely. No weapons. No armor. Just posture. Touch. Stillness. Elias knelt beside a pedestal where twin symbols met in spiraled union, neither dominant, neither erased. "I don't think this was a fortress," he finally said. "I think it was built to preserve connection." Seraxa whispered, "A love temple." The words shouldn't have fit. But they did. And then, the resonance changed. Not in sound but in presence. Somewhere deep inside the structure, the biosynth tech in Seraxa's leg responded. It began to blink in rhythm with a frequency that hadn't existed until now. The light it cast formed patterns, looped arches and mirrored codes. Elias's wrist console picked up a signal. Not comms. Not surveillance. Emotion. Data structured as feeling. Not images, not thoughts. Mood. Warmth. Sorrow. Unity. Separation. Reunion. This place had stored emotion, preserved the imprint of an alien bond so deep it survived extinction. A cathedral of love, left behind in stone. And slowly, without needing to say a word, they understood what they had found. This place was built not to fight over territory, but to prove that connection was real once. That love had meaning once. That across galaxies, even the most alien minds had longed to not be alone. They sat at the center of the chamber, beneath the converging suns. The light spiraled around them, gilding Seraxa's face in gold and Elias's eyes in silver. Her hand found his not as surrender, not as possession but as agreement. A silent pact born not of attraction alone, but of recognition. Neither of them had asked for this. Both of them had been built to destroy, conditioned to distrust, designed to survive by staying separate. But here, in this ancient heart buried beneath war and time, they finally surrendered to something older than language, deeper than biology, more dangerous than the war that hunted them. The belief that they could choose a third path. Neither Ryan nor human. Not union through politics. Not assimilation. But resonance. Two beings tuned, through shared survival, shared silence, shared defiance to the same unspoken frequency. And in that spiral chamber beneath the twin suns of a dying moon, they weren't fugitives anymore. They were proof. It was never supposed to matter. The kiss. The hand held longer than protocol allowed. The way her bioluminescent patterns glowed brighter whenever he entered the room. These were not acts of strategy. Not betrayals. Not to them. But somewhere in the stone lattice of the sanctuary's outer chamber, a machine had been listening. Watching. A drone the size of a bird, cloaked in mimic shielding, had nested itself among the ruins. It bore no insignia, neither Ryan nor human. It didn't need one. It served a purpose beyond species. It served narrative control. And what it recorded was dangerous. Not because it showed enemies speaking. That had happened before. Not because it showed collaboration. Treaties existed. But what it captured, unfiltered and slow, was the unraveling of war itself. Two figures, not exchanging intel, but intimacy. Not plotting, but holding. Not conspiring, but choosing. Hope, in its rawest form. And for the architects of war, hope was sedition. The drone transmitted the footage silently, efficiently. Within hours, both human and Ryan command received copies. Both sides reviewed it in stunned silence. Then disgust. Then fear. The response was not confusion, it was clarity. Because what they saw was not a failure of discipline. It was a breach in the machinery. Love was never part of the equation. They moved fast. Within 36 hours, a joint Ryan-human containment directive was issued, an operation cloaked in diplomatic language but designed for one purpose: elimination of the anomaly. Tactical language in the brief used words like viral interaction, ideological corrosion, non-permissible bonding. But between the lines, it screamed one message: kill the narrative before it spreads. Elias and Seraxa didn't know the storm was coming until it was already thundering underground. The biosynth console picked up atmospheric disruptions, interference patterns, subsurface seismic echoes that weren't tectonic but military entry patterns. Seraxa felt it first. Her new limb pulsed erratically, not from malfunction but proximity. She turned to Elias and simply said, "We've been found." They moved without panic. There was no time for panic. Only instinct. They gathered what they could: maps etched in stone, fragments of tech, pieces of history that would be buried again. The sanctuary shuddered above them, small cascades of dust spilling like warnings from the ceiling. But even as they ran, there was no fear in Elias's face. Only sadness. "I thought maybe they'd let us disappear," he said as they climbed a narrow passage behind the main chamber. "That they'd see we weren't a threat." "They don't fear us," Seraxa said, breath sharp. "They fear what we mean." And what they meant, what they symbolized, was more volatile than any weapon either side had deployed. Because they weren't proof of enemy cooperation. They were proof that the enemy could be loved. The chase began before they reached the second chamber. Twin dropships breached the upper stratum, dropping squads down with precision unheard of in such unstable terrain. Human scouts with Ryan support units, a grotesque parody of Unity, swept the ruins with scanners and rifles. Seraxa glimpsed them from above, Ryans in full exo shells. Humans in thermal stealth gear. But their formation was seamless. They had become what neither side had ever managed before: a perfect union of purpose, forged not by diplomacy, but by shared fear. "Look what we created," Elias whispered. "They're finally working together." "To kill us," she said. They descended deeper, through a vein of the sanctuary that no map showed. Symbols changed here, more abstract, more fluid. Not language. Not instruction. More like poetry. And still the echo of pursuit trembled behind them. One soldier, two nations. Two lovers, all alone. Elias paused only once, looking up into the spiraling roof of what looked like a ritual chamber. "Do you think," he asked, voice trembling, "that they'll erase this place too?" Seraxa touched the wall. It responded, faintly, as if exhausted by remembrance. "They won't need to. They'll erase us. And without witnesses, this will become myth." The thought settled in her like stone. But before the silence grew too heavy, Elias took her hand. "Then we don't die running. We die proving. Not a declaration. A decision." Behind them, the enemy closed in drones, infrared, motion detectors. But none of those could read what now passed between the two fugitives. It wasn't fear. It wasn't resolve. It was defiance in the form of devotion. And far above, in the sealed war rooms of two civilizations, admirals and strategists watched their footage again. Slower. Closer. Not to confirm threat levels, but to search for something they didn't know how to quantify. Why did this matter so much? Why did a kiss in the dark strike more fear than an orbital cannon? Why did a touch say more than a treaty? They had no answer. Because what they feared wasn't the physical act. It was the idea that war was not inevitable. That connection across species, culture, biology was not only possible, but natural. They feared it because hope cannot be controlled. Just like during the Christmas truce of 1914, when soldiers left trenches to sing and share food with their enemies, only to be punished for humanity. History repeated itself not in battles but in those rare, luminous moments when enemies saw each other not as threats, but as reflections. And in those moments, systems cracked. Because a soldier can be replaced. But an idea? An idea survives. There was no welcome ceremony. No flags. No fanfare. Just pressurized corridors, glass doors that sealed behind them with hydraulic sighs, and a quiet that felt manufactured. The guild station hung above Proxima B9 like a satellite of forgotten purpose, neutral, immaculate, immune to the chaos turning below. It wasn't peace. It was insulation. They walked through its central promenade flanked by sentient species from across the spiral arm, each wrapped in their own cultural silos. Humans bartered over shipment routes with insectoid tacticians. Ryans whispered in clustered knots, exchanging data keys and mineral codes. No one looked at them. And yet everyone noticed them. Elias felt at first the subtle change in air pressure when conversations ceased upon their arrival, the delayed glances, the security drones hovering a second too long. Seraxa saw it in the reflections, guild personnel watching from mirrored panels, pretending not to care. But their biosynth readings, linked now through subcutaneous feedback, confirmed it. The station had turned its gaze inward. They were anomalies. Living disruptions. And anomalies were never left to drift freely. Quarters were assigned. Not guest suites, observation cells, repurposed for comfort. Walls embedded with sensors. Surfaces that recorded temperature fluctuations. Meals arrived without attendants. Medical staff entered only in pairs. Every question posed to them was phrased as clinical curiosity, never recognition. What level of neural integration does your biosynth limb achieve during REM cycle? Does your species' pheromone expression affect his biological responses? Have you attempted reproduction? Seraxa said little. But her eyes, faceted and sharp, never stopped scanning. Elias answered when necessary, but always with control. He had worked in triage. He recognized a cage when he was placed in one, no matter how polished the floors. The guild had no prisons. It had studies. Behind closed doors, diplomatic officials debated protocols. The footage of Elias and Seraxa's escape had already gone viral in restricted networks. The problem wasn't their existence, it was their effect. Station staff began whispering. Some asked if the story was real. Others asked if it mattered. What if love doesn't obey borders? One tech had written in a private message. It had been flagged, archived, and scrubbed within 2 minutes. They called it synthetic contamination. But nothing about what was growing between Elias and Seraxa was synthetic. The limb that joined them, grown in desperation, had evolved into a conduit of resonance. Its bioluminescence now pulsed in rhythms both species recognized, despite having no linguistic overlap. Seraxa had begun to modify it voluntarily, adding filaments from her own DNA, carving patterns that echoed ancient Ryan bonding sigils. It was no longer a limb. It was a garden. Of memory. Of choice. Of betrayal and blooming. One scientist, a xenobotanist from the Delaii species, whispered during a private scan, "Your biosynth graft emits pheromonic pulses aligned with symbiotic flora. It's mimicking plant logic. You're growing connection, not just wiring it." Elias asked quietly, "Then why are we being locked in a lab instead of celebrated?" The scientist looked down. "Because systems don't care what grows. Only what spreads." Later that cycle, their visitation rights were suspended. Medical checkups became daily and increasingly invasive. Analysts rotated through their quarters under the guise of multi-species diplomacy workshops. Guild security randomly scanned their room every 6 hours. But the real shift happened during an encrypted conversation between Guild Command and a cluster of anonymous funders. They called them cultural risk factors. They labeled Seraxa an identity destabilizer. They labeled Elias a mission compromise. Not heroes. Disruptors. Just like whistleblowers of Earth's own history, those who had uncovered corruption, or hidden truths, or the quiet evil of indifference. They had not been given medals. They had been given silence. Suspension. Vanishing. Seraxa understood first. "They won't kill us," she told Elias. "They'll study us until we forget who we were." Her voice wasn't bitter. It was clinical. Observant. But when he reached for her hand, she took it and her limb lit green, then violet, then a shade of coral no human language had ever named. The graft pulsed along the wall. A sympathetic pulse. A signal. Not of distress. Of life refusing to be catalogued. In that moment, surrounded by machines, by cold logic and protocol-enforced peace, Elias whispered what neither of them had dared to say. "This place is the most advanced habitat in the system. It connects worlds, controls resources, builds futures. But it doesn't feel." Seraxa's reply was soft. "Then we are not guests. We are infection." That night, the graft grew roots. Not physically but symbolically. The bioluminescent patterns etched themselves across the chamber walls. Not from intention. From presence. From unfiltered being. From truth too wild to fit sterile systems. They had not escaped war. They had become its consequence. And like all seeds, they knew. If they stayed rooted long enough, they would bloom. It didn't begin with vows. There were no rings. No robes. No rows of witnesses seated in ceremonial alignment. The space they chose was a greenhouse module repurposed for life-form acclimation, where synthetic sunlight streamed in from a filtered dome and strange flowers bloomed without names. The air smelled like a memory-wet ozone, pollen from alien vines, and the metallic tang of sterile soil. It was quiet and alive. Elias stood beneath a canopy of twisting stalks that responded to movement by shifting color from violet to ochre to a pearl scent shade that had no equivalent on Earth. His formal medical uniform was clean, but the insignia had been removed. He was no longer an officer. Just a man. Not human only but something more. Something rewritten by choice. Across from him stood Seraxa, her crystalline skin glowing in fractal rhythm, patterned in ceremonial glyphs made not from her culture but invented, adapted. Her biosynth limb, once a wound, now shimmered like sculpture. It bore carvings etched in both Ryan code and human script, one word repeated in multiple tongues. Alive. The ritual had no precedent. It wasn't recognized by the guild. Not by human legal systems. Not by Ryan ancestral lines. But the act itself defied legality. This wasn't marriage. It was melding. Two intelligences choosing to reject not only the war that created them but the definitions they were expected to remain within. A biotechnician from the guild offered them the integration thread and neural fiber strands synthesized to bridge dissimilar nervous systems. It had been experimental, unused, archived. Until now. Seraxa took one end. Elias the other. And as they each inserted the thread's tip into their skin, she beneath the collarbone, he at the base of the wrist, there was no pain. Only resonance. A flicker. A pulse. Then stillness. Followed by connection. Not thoughts. Not speech. But presence. A field of shared sensation. Her emotions became texture in his bones. His memories trembled behind her eyes. Neither invasive. Neither overpowering. But intimate in the way only willing surrender can be. There were no secrets. Not because they were confessed. But because they were no longer separated. Biological fusion was only part of it. The deeper shift happened in the symbolism. This act, two former enemies, once assigned to eliminate one another, now sharing neural current in a botanical chamber surrounded by the life of neither world, was a declaration more volatile than protest, more powerful than rebellion. It was a rewrite of identity through the raw medium of the flesh. They hadn't just fallen in love. They had chosen to become a third thing. And that third thing terrified institutions. Outside, the guild tried to contain the implications. Their story had already leaked to various Black Channel comms, igniting speculation across the fringe sectors. Were they symbols of peace? Were they engineered? Were they traitors? No system had language for what they had done. No tradition could classify it. And that was precisely the point. This act, this fusion, was a deliberate rejection of binary structure. Human and alien. Soldier and healer. Self and other. It was a mirror held to the cosmos, reflecting the question that war, diplomacy, and biology had never dared to ask. What comes after the categories collapse? Across the station, scientists argued. Security protocols were revised. Subroutines were set to monitor neural drift. One report referred to Elias and Seraxa as a hybrid consciousness event. Another as code breach phenomena. But no file could capture what was happening. Because it wasn't data. It was myth. Living, breathing, growing myth. Seraxa later carved a symbol into the greenhouse wall with the tip of her biosynth nail. It was a spiral within a spiral, Ryan shorthand for self in transformation. Elias, without being told, drew a circle around it. Not to contain it, but to honor it, to offer it shelter. And together, they named this act not marriage, Not alliance. But something older than either species had remembered. Becoming. And like Spock in Earth stories born of logic and emotion, a Vulcan and human, a being once seen as anomaly, had become archetype. They were not contradiction. They were evolution. It began as a flicker. Not of light. Of attention. In a control room buried beneath the mid-strata of a guild relay station, an algorithm flagged an unusual engagement spike on a non-priority comm thread. A low-traffic data segment suddenly surged with activity, views, shares, mirrored broadcasts. The thread had no title. No encryption. Just a timestamp and a symbol. A spiral inside a circle. Inside the file, 15 minutes of footage. 2 figures in a greenhouse, one human, one Ryan, standing hand in hand beneath a canopy of breathing plants. No narration. No sound. Only bioluminescent pulses flashing across a synthetic limb, and the slow, synchronized motion of 2 bodies exhaling as one. The footage spread like infection. First to outer colonies, unregulated, curious, hungry for unsanctioned truths. Then to border fleets, where war fatigue had become more viral than morale. Then deeper to medical archives, xenodiplomatic academies, unindexed terminals in shadowed corners of ships too old to matter. And with each new server it touched, it altered something subtle. It rewrote the pattern of belief. Because what it showed was not victory. Not surrender. But coexistence. Not in theory. Not in treaty. But in flesh. It showed something neither species leadership had ever prepared for, the unthinkable normalization of union. And when the military saw it, they called it subversion. They shut down networks. Blocked nodes. Disrupted data clusters. But every deletion made it spread faster. Every censorship confirmed its importance. And soon, the signal wasn't just visual. It became code. Embedded in music. Hidden in light frequencies. A meme of meaning, too alive to control. Inside a barracks in the Ryan Expanse, a young cadet watched the footage in the dark, eyes wide not with fear, but recognition. She'd been taught humans were chaos, emotion unbound, a threat to ordered civilization. But as she watched the Ryan woman choose the human man not from weakness, but from clarity, something inside her cracked. And she sent a message to someone she'd hidden feelings for on a mining station 2 systems away. Do you still think we have to wait until it's over? Inside a human patrol ship, 2 soldiers shared earbuds and listened to a remix of a bootleg transmission, pulses of Ryan biosynth rhythms blended with human heart monitors, layered over a reading of an old Earth poem, "We are the others we were told to fear." In refugee colonies where displaced species had clustered in silence, the footage played on loop. Not as romance, but as permission. A soldier on a surveillance satellite resigned his post and left a final message: "They told us love was a weakness. Now I know it was always the escape hatch." War doctrine wavered. Propaganda screens were defaced not with slogans, but with symbols. Spiral within circle. Redrawn in alleyways. Painted in cryogenic pods. Carved into abandoned drones. The mark wasn't claimed by either species. It was claimed by those who chose to leave the war behind without waiting for permission. The Guild convened emergency councils. Commanders accused one another of letting the story leak. The Ryan Parliament declared the couple a psychological contagion. The human triad labeled them strategic biohazards. But their labels arrived too late. Because by then, couples had begun stepping forward. A Ryan biologist and a human linguist in orbit around Lyra 8 sharing an apartment, unregistered. a human engineer and Orion pilot on a cargo hauler transmitting nightly broadcasts of shared dreams. Orion male and human male, bonded secretly for 3 years, now walking openly in a civilian outpost with hands held tight. And none of them asked for legal recognition. None of them demanded change. They only did one thing. Existed. And the systems, built to erase such stories before they could root, found themselves drowning. Because this wasn't rebellion. It was redefinition. And like apartheid couples who married in secret. Like Jewish and Arab lovers who dared to meet in cities split by concrete and centuries. Like the forbidden romances across barbed wire and bombed out fields, this too became myth that refused to remain hidden. Seraxa and Elias never broadcasted their story. They didn't have to. Because once a single thread of truth is seen woven into skin, into gesture, into unapologetic love, it cannot be untangled. The signal was no longer theirs. It was everyone's. And the war, though it still roared on paper, in meetings, in ceremonial uniforms, had already lost something it couldn't retrieve. Control of the narrative. The garden was not part of the original station design. It had grown out of necessity, a pressure valve for minds no longer suited to war. Engineers had once called it a biophilic experiment. Botanists called it oxygen management. But for those who walked its quiet paths, it was something else entirely. A womb for the future. Above it, Proxima B9 still turned, now a hushed sphere veiled in orbital shadows. The war had not ended with surrender. It had ended with forgetting. The treaties signed after the unrest were mostly ceremonial, empty acknowledgments that the will to fight had simply collapsed. Not under force. Not from diplomacy. But from erosion. Erosion caused by story. By two names whispered in hallways, by footage rewatched like sacred text, by a grafted limb glowing like a forgotten star, by a kiss planted deeper than species or protocol could comprehend. And now, in this garden suspended between two suns and no flag, a new story began, not in violence, but in heartbeat. The child was born beneath the flowering canopy of xenolilies that bloomed according to neural resonance. The petals opened only when sung to. Seraxa's bioluminescent skin pulsed in rhythmic waves as she labored, her fingers gripping Elias's hand, and his eyes never left hers, not even when her breathing shifted into Ryan vibration frequencies that made the chamber hum like a temple. There were no midwives. Only the guild's silent biomonitors, calibrated for neither species but learning from both. The child emerged not in pain, but in convergence, limbs curled like spiral vines, skin a soft shade of opalescent tone that shimmered between human melanin and Ryan crystal-layered translucence. No cry came. Only breath. Steady. Curious. Alive. And when the child opened its eyes, they were not blue. Not violet. They were mirror black, like void matter absorbing light, not to destroy it, but to hold it. The guild had no designation for the child. No species code. No gene label. They called it X0 in internal records. But Seraxa and Elias named it with a single glyph, a hand reaching into a spiral. It meant nothing. It meant everything. Others came, slowly, cautiously. Families with similar stories. Children born in between. Some had scales. Some had feathers. One pulsed with light instead of voice. But all had something the old world feared, untraceable lineage. And with that came freedom. The child grew quickly, not in years, but in perception. At 3 solar cycles, it spoke fluently in human syntax and Ryan tonal wave. At 5, it asked no questions about its origin, only about the stars it had never seen. By 7, it had begun sculpting memory through code, composing neural symphonies from the stories of soldiers who had once tried to kill one another and now met for tea beneath alien trees. And it was during one such gathering, as former commanders from both sides sat on the moss-grown stones of the synthetic pond, that the child asked the question no one could answer. Why did you ever need a flag? Silence followed. Not discomfort. Not shame. Just silence carved by awe at the clarity of something that should have been obvious for centuries. Flags had boundaries. The child had none. It played with both Ryan artifacts and human toys. It cried in tones. It dreamed in pulses. Its nightmares were not of war but of becoming too much like either side. It wasn't born to balance them. It was born to transcend them. And one evening, as the station's orbit took it between the twin suns again, casting a shadow across the atmosphere of the world once drowned in blood, the child stood at the observation deck with Seraxa's hand in one and Elias's in the other. It asked, "Did I end the war?" Elias whispered, "You were never meant to end it. You were meant to begin something." Seraxa added, "You are not a victory. You are a mutation." The child smiled. Then love is the mutation that worked. And in that moment, under light never meant for either race, a being without history, without nation, without tribe became the future not by inheritance, but by presence. It would never be fully human. Never fully alien. But it would be wholly alive. And in its breath, its gestures, its gaze, civilizations rewrote their memory not through decree, but through recognition. That war had failed to erase connection. That fear had failed to protect purity. That control had failed to shape destiny. Because what evolved wasn't strength, wasn't domination. It was love. Unqualified, untamed, unclaimed. And in the annals of both species, long after borders blurred and timelines collapsed, the name of the child was never written in capital cities. It was etched in gardens. And whispered through stories. Like a song no system could forget. This story wasn't about war. It was about what survives when war ends. A wounded Ryan. A disillusioned human. A love that shouldn't have happened and yet changed everything. In a world where sides were chosen by blood and birth, they chose each other. And from that choice came not just peace, but evolution. Now, I want to hear from you. Milky Way, what part of this story moved you the most? Thought balloon, if you were in Seraxa's place, abandoned by your people, saved by your enemy, would you trust him? Dizzy, would you dare to love across enemy lines, knowing the entire universe might turn against you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about love, loyalty, and the real cost of peace. And if you want more tales where alien encounters become mirrors of the human soul, don't forget to subscribe to the Alien Storyverse. We'll be here, waiting among the stars.